You're listening to old Western stories, where dust settles slow, guns speak loud, and every tale rides straight into your imagination. Hit that subscribe and saddle up, the ride's just startin'. Some men swear a man can lay his yesterdays down like a worn-out saddle, drop it in the dust and walk on. Some towns take comfort thinking a preacher has always been a preacher, born gentle, born clean. Now and again, a quiet Sabbath comes when the Lord chooses to test both notions. On one such Sunday, with the sky clear and the wind mild, something long buried walked toward Willow Bend. Late morning light slanted through the tall windows of the little church, falling in pale bars across rough plank walls and the bowed heads beneath. Benches gave off small creaks as folks settled, boots rasped soft on the boards, a muffled cough, a low chuckle, the easy sounds of people who believed the worst of the world lay somewhere far beyond their town. Outside, a wagon rattled past on Main Street, the grind of wheels and jingle of harness slipping in through the open doors along with the dry scent of cottonwoods. Willow Bend had grown tame. Doors went unbarred most nights. Children ran errands alone. The only gunfire anyone heard these days came from boys knocking bottles off fence posts by the creek. People liked to say the wild times had moved on, and they said it with the settled comfort of folks who had a preacher they trusted. Micah Caldwell stood behind the simple pine pulpit that morning, coat black and plain, collar straight, boots clean but long since new. He was a man of middling height, neither broad nor thin, his hair touched with early silver at the temples, his dark gaze steady but not stern. His right hand rested easy on the big Bible, brown fingers spread, a faint pale scar running along the back of that hand like a dry creek bed. When Micah spoke, his voice came out low and even carrying to the back row without strain, the way a slow river fills its banks. "You carry what you must," he said, looking over his people. "Out here, a man carries water, tools, the work his family needs done. He carries hurt from lean years and hard losses. He carries things he never names. But there comes a time the Lord asks him to set some of it down." The benches murmured as backs leaned a little forward. A breeze slid through the doorway, stirring skirts and coat hems, lifting a few stray hairs at the nape of a neck. Somewhere near the rear a baby fussed, then went quiet against a mother's shoulder. Outside sounds blurred to a soft hum, a dog bark, a single hammer strike, a distant laugh. The peace in the room deepened. "You know the weight of a thing held too long," Micah went on. "A grudge, a fear, a wrong done and never brought into the light. It grows heavier the longer a man clings to it. The Lord may not tear it from your hands. Sometimes he just asks you to lay it down and admit you were never meant to bear it forever." His thumb rubbed the pulpit's edge where the grain dipped, finding that spot by habit. His right shoulder rolled the slightest fraction, an old motion, as if it remembered a burden that had once sat there in iron instead of cloth. For a breath his eyes dropped to a knot in the floorboards near his boots, then rose again to the faces lifted toward him. To the good people of Willow Bend, those small movements meant nothing. Micah was the man who had come 3 years back with a quiet word and a steady look, who sat at sickbeds, who spoke soft over graves, who joined young hands in marriage with a tired but honest smile. They poured their trust into him easy, never wondering how much lay beneath what they could see. "Some say once a thing is buried, it is gone," he said, his tone softening. "But the earth remembers what you press into it. The past has a way of putting its boots back on and walking toward you, sooner or later." A ripple of sound moved over the benches, half rueful, half relieved. Folks thought of small quarrels and old shames and took comfort that even heavy hearts might yet find rest. No one thought to set those words against the preacher himself. The church doors stood wide, throwing a bright stripe of dust-danced light down the center aisle. The hinges grumbled now and then when the wind nudged them, and the flame of a single candle at the back wall shivered in its tin cup. On one such nudge of breeze, another sound slipped in. Slow, measured boots crossing the porch, then the hollow thump of heels on the church floor. The stranger stepped inside without hurry. He paused just past the threshold, letting his eyes travel the room. He did not take off his hat. The brim left his face in shadow and he let it be. His trail-marked coat hung straight, his hands loose and empty at his sides. Spur chain gave a faint, telling clink in the hush. People felt him before they fully saw him. Heads turned, starting at the back and rolling forward. A few men straightened where they sat. One woman's grip tightened on her prayer book until the leather creaked. It was not yet fear that moved through the room. It was the sense of something sharp laid down among soft things. Micah's next words fell away unspoken. His gaze locked on the man in the doorway and did not move. Something old stirred inside his chest, unwelcome and heavy, like a locked trunk shifting on its own. His fingers curled harder around the pulpit edge, whitening the scar on his hand, but his face stayed calm. The stranger tipped his chin a fraction, no more, and started down the center aisle. Each step sounded clear in the hush, heel, toe, faint clink. He chose the end of a bench 2 rows from the front and sat without waiting to be shown. He did not bow his head. Instead he turned enough to keep Micah in full view, and one pale eye caught the light from the nearest window. When he spoke, his voice was low but clean, reaching every corner. "You were speakin' on burdens, Reverend," he said. The words slid along the pews like cold water, on layin' down what a man was not meant to hold. Micah's answer came slow. "That is so," he said. "The Lord gives rest to the weary." The stranger's mouth shifted, almost a smile, almost not. "Reckon I rode a long trail to see if that were so," he replied. Silence followed, wide and expectant. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath at the door. Then the man in the shadowed hat drew a quiet breath and set his next words down with care. "Tell me, preacher," he said, "does the Lord give rest to a man once known as Jonah Pike?" The name hung there in the little church, heavy as iron, and every soul inside felt the weight of it settle on the air. Silence took the name and held it there, like a prayer nobody wanted to finish. Benches did not so much as groan. Hands froze halfway through setting hymnals aside. A baby gave one small, confused whimper and was hushed at once, as if even an infant's cry might stir whatever had just been called into the open. Jonah Pike. The sound of it still seemed to hang above the pulpit, though no one dared repeat it, clinging there in the dust motes like smoke that would not thin. Micah's face did not crack. The line of his mouth stayed even, his dark eyes steady, but something in the set of his shoulders told of a man bracing against a blow already landed. He let one slow breath move in and out, barely lifting his chest, and then he looked past the stranger, over the room of faces turned up to him, their trust gone bright and sharp with questions. "We will close," he said, voice low but whole. "May the Lord watch between us as we part." No one bowed their head until he did. Only then did the spell break enough for the familiar murmur of closing prayer, words mumbled more than spoken, scraping up against the name that had interrupted their Sabbath. When the final amen drifted into quiet, nobody moved for a long beat. Folks sat there like cattle smelling lightning, not seeing it yet but knowing the air had changed. The outlaw, no one here yet called him that aloud, but the word fit him and he wore it easy, remained seated 2 rows from the front, hat still on. One arm draped along the back of the pew as though he had all the time in the world. He did not reach for anyone. He did not reach for anything steel. Just sat and owned the space around him, the way a man does who has walked into many rooms and seldom found reason to hurry back out. A woman near the back let out a thin breath and whispered, "Jonah Pike," under it, like she was testing whether saying it quiet would make it less real. The man beside her shot her a warning glance and cut his eyes toward Micah, and she swallowed the rest of her thought. Micah stepped out from behind the pulpit without looking at the stranger directly. His hand brushed the Bible's worn cover as he passed, fingers lingering as if he might anchor himself to something older than his own history. "Go in peace," he said to the room. The words were the same as every Sunday. The way he said them was not. There was weight dragging at the edges, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleepless nights at sickbeds. For an instant his gaze met the Outlaws, just the briefest crossing of trails, and what flickered there was not denial, not quite acceptance either, but a quiet nod to the fact that some truths had walked into the light whether he welcomed them or not. Folks rose in fits and starts, benches croaked and sighed, boots scuffed the floorboards slower than usual, careful, as if a quick step might start a stampede. No one rushed the preacher with questions. No one thanked him for the sermon the way they usually did. Instead, they watched him the way men watch a far-off dust cloud, trying to judge if it means trouble or just passing weather. The outlaw stood last. When he did it easy, a long straightening that never broke his line of sight on Micah. He tipped his head not quite enough to call it respect and stepped into the aisle. People parted for him by instinct more than fear, shifting hips and skirts, drawing in a touch closer to family. A father near the side wall laid a firm hand on his boy's collar and pulled him back from where the child craned for a better look, the boy's boots sliding a short, protesting squeak along the planks. Outside, the wagon noise had thinned, but the day was moving on all the same, sun climbing toward its noon glare. Dust motes spun through the open doorway like tiny ghosts in the light. One by one, then in twos and threes, the congregation drifted toward the exit, each step slowed by the need to glance sideways at the stranger and then back at Micah, as if trying to fit both men inside one Sunday morning. Near the door, an older rancher with wind-seamed skin and worn cuffs hesitated, then reached out and brushed his fingers just once against Micah's sleeve as he passed. It was no more than the ghost of a touch, but it said, "I still stand with you, whatever this is." The man did not speak. He did not have to. Micah felt the small, stubborn loyalty carry more comfort than any shouted defense. A few breaths later, a mother herded her two girls out with tighter hands than usual, gathering their shoulders to her like a shield, angling them wide around him. She kept her eyes on the floor, skirts whispering quick, refusing even the chance that the stranger's gaze might catch hers. From the corner of his eye, Micah saw how many followed that pattern, shrinking their circle away from him as much as from the man who had named him. The outlaw stepped into the doorway but did not leave the shadowed threshold. He stood where the outside light haloed him and the church's dim made his face hard to read. He turned a fraction, looking back into the room once more, letting the last few stragglers see him plain if they wished. A thin, knowing smile ghosted across his mouth, gone almost before it formed, the kind a man wears when plans are unfolding right on time. Then he moved down onto the church steps. Heat met him first, that high country sun strong and white. Horses stood tied along the hitch rail out front, most of them the familiar cow ponies and plow nags of Willow Bend. Micah's gaze slid past them and caught on two he did not know. Lean animals with trail dust dried stiff along their flanks, reins looped loose, saddles still loaded for distance. One was hitched a bit apart from the others, half shadowed by the side wall. The other stood farther down, near the corner where the street opened into the main stretch of town. Both had the look of mounts that had galloped hard and stopped only because a rider told them to. Behind the horses, at the far end of the boardwalk, a slouching figure leaned in what might have been casual ease against a post. Hat brim pulled low, arms folded, he looked for all the world like any other drifter taking the day's measure. Only his boots were set too square, too ready, and his head did not turn with the easy curiosity of a man watching churchgoers spill out. His face stayed angled toward the front steps as if his eyes could see through his own brim. Micah marked him in silence, the way an old trail hand marks a dry gulch that might flash flood come rain. The outlaw did not call to that distant shape. He did not need to. His quiet held the space between them like a taut rope. On the steps, townsfolk bunched and thinned in strange currents. A pair of young men who usually joked with Micah after service today drifted aside, talking low at the edge of the yard, glancing his way and then looking off quick whenever he met their eyes. A storekeep's wife, cheeks pink with worry, climbed the steps just enough to murmur, "Reverend, if you're needin' bread, I'll send it over as usual." The way she said it carried more question than promise. "I thank you, ma'am," Micah replied. His voice stayed level, but his throat felt tight, as if the name from inside still pressed there, wanting out again. The outlaw edged a boot heel against the top step and looked sideways at him, studying the man the town knew as Micah Caldwell and measuring him against the ghost of Jonah Pike. "Quiet place," he said, almost pleasant. "Shame, sometimes, what noise can do to a quiet place." A murmur of wind caught that and rolled it down the yard. Micah met his gaze. "Noise don't come on its own," he answered. "Somebody brings it." The outlaw's lids lowered a touch, amusement flickering in the small lines at the corners of his eyes. "Reckon we'll see who brought what," he said. He turned then, giving the street his back as if no danger could come from a town like this, leaving Micah to face his own people. They lingered at the edge of the yard and the boardwalk, small knots and solitary figures, each of them waiting for some word from him that would change the shape of what they had heard. Micah felt all those eyes like weight on his skin. He could stay silent, let rumor do the talking while he hid behind his collar and his good works. That might buy him a day, maybe two. But watching the dust lift from the strangers' horses, seeing the shadowed figure at the end of the walk still fixed on the church, he knew this was not trouble that would drift off if no one spoke of it. The sun climbed a little higher, glaring off the windows of the mercantile down the street, and the whole day seemed to lean in one direction, toward whatever waited just beyond what anyone could yet see. Micah stood where the packed dirt of the churchyard met the start of the boardwalk, boots rooted, as if the ground there was the last piece of sure footing left him. The town moved slow in his edges of sight, folks trimming their paths to arc wider than they needed to around him and around the man who had spoken his old name. Children were steered back toward houses and yards with hands that gripped a little too tight, voices that sounded just a shade too bright. A laugh from down the street broke off halfway, the shape of it turning into a cough when Micah's gaze slid that way. The outlaw stayed near the bottom of the church steps, one heel hooked on the lowest riser, shoulder easy against the post. He looked like any trail-worn rider come in for a spell, hat low, coat hanging straight, but the space around him felt claimed. Men on the far side of the street stood and talked with their bodies turned away, their words angled toward him all the same. A ranch boy leading a mule slowed to stare. His pa hissed his name and jerked the lead rope so sharp the mule tossed its head and snorted. "Reverend," the outlaw said at last, the word rolling out slow, like he was tasting how it fit. His voice carried without needing to climb. "You always did favor quiet towns." Micah let the title hang between them a breath. "Quiet's not a sin," he answered. "Folks earn it, they've a right to keep it." The outlaw's mouth tugged in a faint, lopsided curve. "Ain't much point hidden a name once it's been said out loud," he replied. "World's got a way of rememberin' what a man was, no matter how soft he talks now." A wagon rolled by, wheels bumping over a rut, the driver giving his team more attention than they required so he wouldn't have to admit he was listening. On the hotel balcony above, a curtain moved the slightest inch and then stilled. Near the livery, two strange horses shifted and blew, saddles still heavy with trail gear no Willow Bend hand would be usin' on a Sunday. "This town don't belong to my past," Micah said, eyes steady on the man before him. "It belongs to the Lord and the people tryin' to live decent under him." The outlaw clicked his tongue once, a small, dry sound. "Funny thing about pasts," he murmured. "You walk away from a life like that, it don't always stay put. Sometimes it climbs right up your church steps and asks after you by the name your hand had when it rode iron." A woman crossing the yard with a covered dish for a neighbor faltered, the crock trembling just enough to make its tin lid ring faint. She dipped her head and angled past, but not before a word or two of that last sentence brushed her ears. Micah saw the way her eyes changed, how they slid from him to the outlaw and back, weighing years she'd never seen. "You know nothing of the life I left," Micah said, keeping his tone level, each word set down careful as stones across water. "I know enough," the outlaw answered. His gaze dropped just once to Micah's right side, where a belt would ride if he wore one. "I know your hand sits a certain way, even empty. Knuckles remember drawin' iron, same as a tongue remembers cussin' long after a man swears off it. I know somewhere under boards or behind a wall in this quiet little church world of yours, Steele's layin' in the dark, wrapped up like a body." That made a soft stir at the fringes. A throat cleared where no dust tickled, a boot heel scraping on plank where no pebble lay. Folks had edged closer without meaning to, ears stretching while their feet pretended they were goin' about their usual Sunday. "If you came lookin' for that gun," Micah said, feeling the remembered weight of it under his ribs, "you come for the wrong thing." The outlaw shook his head just enough to shift shadow along his jaw. "I didn't ride this far for cold iron," he said. "I rode for the man that used to wear it. Jonah Pike didn't bury that deep, not where I come from." Somewhere behind Micah, near the church door, a younger voice whispered, "Jonah," and was shushed fast, the hiss of a mother's rebuke sharper than the boy's curiosity. A pair of store clerks standing by their doorway leaned closer to each other, pretending to straighten a crate while their eyes stayed fixed on the two men by the steps. "What you knew of Jonah Pike," Micah replied, "was a man lost, dragging sin behind him like a busted saddle. That man laid his life down before the Lord and took up another. Whatever you think you rode after, you're late. He's gone." The outlaw studied him a long moment like he was looking at a trail sign half covered by sand, seeing the old tracks under the new. "Men don't get to walk that clean," he said quiet. "Not with the things Jonah Pike did. Some debts don't wash out in him water. Some men are owed answers. Some graves are waitin' on reckonin'." Across the way, a hammer that had been keepin' a steady rhythm paused, as if the hand wielding it had forgotten the nail halfway in. "You ain't here for forgiveness," Micah said. "It wasn't a question." "No," the outlaw agreed. "I didn't come for that." His gaze slid past Micah, down the street, where the slouched figure at the end of the boardwalk still leaned against a post, hat low. "I didn't come alone, neither. You've seen 'em. Fella on the balcony, one by the livery, couple more scattered where your folks don't quite see yet. They ain't drawn nor shoutin', but they're here. World tends to listen when men like us gather in a place this small." A low murmur rippled through the few still close enough to hear that much, like wind running through tall grass, fear bending them in different directions. One man stepped a pace nearer to Micah, just enough that his shoulder almost brushed the preacher's, his jaw set in a stubborn line. Another scooped up his little girl and backed away toward his wagon, the child's arms flung around his neck as she peered over his shoulder, eyes big and solemn. "This town's seen its share of graves and sorrow without you bringin' more," Micah said, his voice roughening around the edges. "Whatever reckoning you think you're owed, leave these folks out of it. They never rode where you and I did." The outlaw let that sit, tasting the shape of the plea. "Reckon trouble don't always ask who it steps over," he said. "But I'm a fair man, Jonah. I came to talk first. Let you choose which name you're standin' in when the sun goes down. Preacher," he tipped his chin at the collar, "or the man that used to walk with a gun close to his kidneys and a price on his head." Wind slid down the street, cool for the hour, lifting a strip of dust that swirled and scattered. The church bell rope stirred against its beam with a dry little knock, though no hand pulled it. Micah felt every pair of half-hidden eyes on him, every ear straining for his answer. His throat worked once, and when he spoke it was slow, each syllable carrying more weight than volume. "You won't drag me back to that road," he said. "Not in your words, not in your threats, not with any iron you or your men got tucked under those coats. Whatever comes, I stand as I am now, not as you knew me." The outlaw's smile did not reach his eyes. "We'll see," he murmured. "By nightfall this place'll call you something. Might be Reverend, might be Jonah. Might be nothing but a story they tell about a man who thought burying a gun was the same as burying his past." He pushed off the post, slow and loose, and stepped back into the open street, his shadow longing out ahead of him like the first line of a noose drawn tight. Around them, Willow Bend held its breath, and the day itself felt like it had finally chosen which way it meant to break. CUTPOINT =====. Word count. Tilde 800. By late afternoon, the light in Willow Bend had gone from bright to slanting. Long shadows stretching off hitch rails and porch posts like the town itself was leaning away from something it couldn't quite step clear of. The wind had picked up out of the west, carrying dust along the street in low, restless swirls that nipped at boots and skirts. Hammering that had sounded steady most of the day from some repair down the way fell off at last, the final tap echoing sharper than it should have, like a sentence cut off in the middle. Doors that usually stood open to catch the breeze were pulled near shut, left on a crack just wide enough for eyes to look out and see if the quiet still held. As Micah walked alone down the side of the church toward his house and study, his boots loud in his own ears on the hard-packed ground, a voice drifted from a nearby porch. "You headin' in early, Reverend?" An older man called, trying for easy and not quite reaching it. "Day feels odd." Micah tipped his head without slowing. "Just seein' to some things," he answered. "Keep your door barred till this passes." The man gave a rough, nervous chuckle. "Reckon I will," he said, and Micah heard the low scrape of wood as soon as he'd gone by, a bar set home before the sun was down. The yard that had been full of Sunday talk was thin now, just a stray chicken scratching near the fence line, a dog slinking belly-low from one patch of shade to another. Even the bell rope hung still, no child's hand playing with it, no idle ring. The peace that used to settle over this place like a quilt felt now more like a sheet pulled over something the town didn't dare look at. He stepped into the study and let the door ease shut behind him, the latch catching with a small, final click that sounded too much like a lock being thrown. "Lord," he murmured in the quiet, not quite a prayer, not quite a curse, "what trail have you set under my feet?" The room was the same it had been that morning, the Bible on the desk, the chair, the shelves, but there was no comfort in the sameness. Silence pressed in close, enough that the faint creak of the board under his heel carried like a shout. His eyes slid, unbidden, to that one tight-set plank in the far corner, the one that didn't flex when the others did, the one he had laid himself to cover steel he had sworn never to put on again. "Still there," he said under his breath, as if talking to the floor. "You've been sleeping a long time." He could feel it there without seeing it, could feel the old weight as if it still rode by his spine, the memory of cool metal and warm leather biting at his skin. His right hand twitched, thumb rubbing against forefinger in a motion that had once ended with a grip on a worn handle. He crossed the room before he meant to, every step light and careful, like a man stalking something that might bolt. When he reached the place, he stopped, looking down at the unremarkable board, its grain no different from its neighbor's to any eye but his. The seam where it met the next plank was a hair finer, that was all. Shadow caught a little darker in the line. He bent and let his fingertips rest along that seam, just enough pressure to feel the give of the wood and the chill that lived under it in his mind. One hard pull would lift the board. One more reach and the cloth would fold back. In the space of a breath he was back on another trail in another year, dust in his teeth, sun at his neck, the gun in his hand speaking sudden judgment into the air while men shouted and died around him. "Jonah," a memory voice cried, thin and desperate, and he heard his own younger self answer with iron instead of mercy. He straightened quick, jaw tight, and took his hand off the floor as if it had burned him. "No," he said out loud to the empty room, the word low but sharp enough to make the window pane tremble just a fraction in its frame with the push of his breath. "You stay there. You stay there." He backed away a step, then another, until the desk pressed against his thighs. The Bible lay open where he'd left it, pages riffled a little by the draft sneaking around the sash. He put both hands on either side of it, palms flat, fingers splayed, as if he could hold himself in place by pinning the good book to the wood. "You called me out of that," he whispered, eyes on the print. "Don't ask me to pick it up again." Outside, the boardwalk gave a long creak as someone heavy shifted their weight, not walking on, just leaning. Micah turned his head, looking through the window's narrow slice of street. The outlaw sat in a chair tipped back against the post outside the saloon, one boot hooked on a rung, the other planted sure on the planks. His hat was still low, but Micah knew those eyes were alive under the brim, watchful and patient. A man stepped from the saloon door, paused, and spoke soft to him. "Sun's droppin'," the man said. "You want us movin'?" The outlaw shook his head slightly. "We wait," he replied. "Town'll move itself." His voice carried just enough to slip through the glass. Micah could see two other shapes not far off, one on the hotel balcony, a figure outlined against the dimming sky, another by the livery's corner, half in shadow, half in the last of the sun. None of them fidgeted. None of them paced. They just held their spots and let the town wear itself thin with waiting. Men inside the saloon moved past the open doors without their usual loud talk, their glances quick and sideways toward the chairs outside. A storekeeper across the way stepped out just long enough to drag in a barrel. "You boys done for the day," he called, voice thin. "Day's just settlin' right," the outlaw answered, not bothering to look his way. "Ain't no call to hurry." The storekeeper swallowed, took hold of his door, and pulled it shut with care, the latch drop sounding clear in the thickened air. From somewhere down the back lane came the thud of a bar being set into brackets inside a house door. Another answered it a few breaths later, a dull, heavy knock of wood on wood. Through a cracked window across the street, Micah heard a child's voice, high and troubled. "Ma, why can't we go out?" A woman's tone followed, soft but tight. "You hush now. You stay where I can see you. World's loud today." He let his head fall forward a little, eyes closing. This town had taken him in when he rode in with dust on his coat and a new name on his tongue, believing he'd always worn the collar he now had. They'd trusted him with their dead, their sick, their weddings, their worst troubles. Now their houses were shuddering against a man who knew another name for him, and the only thing between them and whatever that man had come to collect was iron buried in his own floor and words he had not yet spoken. Footsteps came up the stoop, slow and deliberate. A shadow crossed the lower crack of light under his door. Something small touched wood with a soft clunk, set down rather than kicked. "For you, Reverend," a low voice said through the panel. Micah knew it. It was the outlaws, stripped of the mockery he'd used in town, wearing something closer to business. "Don't say I came without warning." The steps walked away, steady and unhurried. Micah waited, listening to be sure no one lingered, then stepped forward and eased the door open. On the stoop lay a chip of wood shaved thin and smooth, like a sliver planed off some beam. Across it, burned with a sure hand, was the rough outline of a pistol and a simple mark for sundown, a low arc with lines dropping from it like rays. No name, no more words, just the picture and the time. Micah picked it up, felt its warmth from the branding iron that must have kissed it not long ago. "You think I don't understand you," he muttered, looking toward the street where the outlaw sat. "I know what this is." The message in it was clear as any shouted challenge. The outlaw meant to choose when this ended, and he meant Micah to know there was still iron between them, buried or not. Micah turned the sliver in his fingers until the edges bit his skin, then set it on the table beside the Bible, the gun mark pointing toward that tight-laid board in the corner. Evening was coming down out of the hills, slow but sure. He could see it in the way the light outside had gone from gold to a flatter, harder color, in the way the wind had a cooler hand on the leaves. Men were on their porches now, some with shotguns leaned close at hand, pretending they were just watching the sky. "You seein' this, Reverend?" one called quietly down the lane when Micah stepped out for a breath of the cooling air. "We ain't blind." "I see it," Micah said. "Stay with your families, bar your doors." The man nodded once serious. "You do what you gotta do," he answered. Others kept to shadow, eyes bright in the gloom as they watched the riders watch them. Every unlit lamp, every unspoken word, every quiet breath felt like tinder stacked high, waiting on the smallest spark. Micah knew then that he had run out of room to stand in the middle. If he kept his past locked under that board and his tongue tied behind the collar, folks he'd prayed over and buried kin for might pay his debt in blood that was not theirs. If he took up what he'd laid down, he'd be stepping back onto a trail he knew too well, one that didn't often leave room for men who called themselves shepherds. Behind him, in the deepening dusk, he heard the outlaw's voice carry soft up the street. "Sundown, Jonah," he said, not loud, not hurried. "World's gonna know you one way or the other." As the first long shadows of evening reached across his floor toward that hidden plank, Micah understood that when full dark settled over Willow Bend, staying silent would be the loudest choice he could make, and it would not be one the town survived. Sundown found the sky over Willow Bend bruised purple at the edges. The last of the light caught low on the windows and dust like fire in the air. Lamps were baying, lit slow along the street, one here, one there, yellow eyes opening careful behind thin panes. Inside his study, Micah stood over the corner board, the tight one, the one that had sat quiet on his sin for 3 long years. His hand hovered above it, knuckles scarred and still, while the wind worried at the eaves. "You pick it up, you might not put it down again," he muttered, more to himself than to any listening heaven. The floor did not answer. Somewhere outside, a man laughed short and hard, the sound breaking off like a stick. Micah let out a breath that had been sittin' in him all day. "I ain't reachin' for you to be who I was," he said low. "I'm reachin' so these folks don't pay for what I done." Then he crouched, slid his fingers in at the fine seam and levered the board up. The old oilcloth lay there, dull in the dim, wrapped tight around the shape he knew too well. He lifted it out like it might shatter and unrolled it slow. The gun lay bare in the lamplight, steel worn to a soft gray shine along the edges, the grip darkened by a younger man's sweat. For a moment his hand hovered, then settled on it. "You feel heavier than I recall," he said, and slid it into a plain, scarred belt he had kept for work and never for war, drawing the leather snug around his waist beneath his coat. He covered the whole back over, the board laid straight as it had been, and set his boot on it once firm. "I put you back when this is done," he promised, quiet, "or I don't come back at all." When he stepped out onto the little stoop, the air hit him cooler, carrying the smell of lamp smoke and horse and the first thin bite of night. The street had hollowed out, men on porches, women behind curtains, children's eyes wide in the spaces between. He heard a whisper from the dark of one doorway. "That him, Ma, the bad man." A woman's answer came soft. "They ain't but men, both of 'em. You hush and pray." At the far end of the street, by the saloon and the well, the outlaw stood easy in the open, hat brim tipped just enough to show the lines of his mouth. His riders were shadows at the edges, one by the livery, one near the hotel steps, another leaned against the rail outside the mercantile, hands buried in his coat, shoulders set. They weren't showing guns yet. They didn't have to. The town could feel steel without seeing it. The outlaw stepped out from the lamplight, boots scraping soft on the dust. "Evenin', Jonah," he called, voice calm as creek water. "Clock says you got here on time." Micah walked out to meet him, boots making small puffs in the dirt, coat hanging straight, no hurry in his stride. Somewhere behind him, a porch plank groaned as someone leaned forward to see better. Another soul crossed himself in the dark. "Name's Micah now," he said when they were close enough to see each other's eyes. "Reckon you know that." The outlaw studied him, head canted a little. "I know what you're callin' yourself," he replied. "Question is, which name you're willin' to die under." Micah's jaw worked once. "I ain't lookin' to die," he said, "but I ain't lettin' you bleed this town for what I did before I came here." The outlaw's smile was thin. "Town's already bled on account of you," he said. "Just don't know it yet. Men I rode with, men you put in the ground when you were wearin' that iron like skin. Some of 'em had folks, some of 'em had brothers. I'm speakin' for what's left." A voice from a nearby porch broke in, tremblin'. "Reverend, you don't owe this man nothin'," a rancher called, then faltered when the outlaw's gaze slid his way. "Go on inside, Hank," Micah said without looking back. "This ain't for your house." The door closed at once, bar dropping with a dull thud. The outlaw's eyes flicked that direction, then back. "They'll do what you tell 'em," he said. "Just like they did when you asked 'em to trust you. Seems to me they ought to know who they been tithin' to." Micah's hand brushed the edge of his coat where the gun rode hidden, fingers steady. "You rode all this way to strip my name," he answered. "Say it then. Shout it up and down the street. But you ain't puttin' their blood on my ledger to balance yours." The man by the livery spat in the dust. "Talk's cheap," he drawled. "We ain't here for talk." One of the shapes at the mercantile rail shifted, the faint outline of a rifle sliding an inch clearer from under a coat. Micah watched it from the corner of his eye. "You lay that down," he called to the shadow, voice carrying flat and even. "Ain't a man here lookin' to die for another fella's grudge." The outlaw lifted a hand, lazy-like. "Hold easy," he told his man, then glanced back at Micah. "You think puttin' on a collar wiped you clean," he said. "It don't. World don't work that way, Jonah. Only sure reckonin' I ever saw came at muzzle flash." "You seen little then," Micah replied. "Reckonin's every day you wake up and don't pick up what you want. Every day you choose not to be who you were. I've been payin' that sun up to sundown for years." For a moment there was only the wind, pushing dust along the street, tugging at coat tails. A child whimpered somewhere and was hushed. The outlaw's eyes narrowed. "You could have met me alone," he said. "Rode out, settled it like the old days where nobody had to watch. You stayed, you let 'em see. Maybe you wanted 'em to know." "No," Micah said. "I stayed 'cause if I ride out you ride in and you bring these boys through their doors to drag 'em out front. I'd rather stand in the open." The outlaw's jaw flexed, a muscle jumping near his ear. "You preachin' or you drowin'?" he asked. "Talk's about run its course." Lampflame wavered in windows up and down the street. The man at the mercantile rail shifted again. This time the rifle came clear, just the barrel, nudged toward a window where a woman's pale face showed. Micah saw it and his voice cut through the hush. "Don't," he called sharp. "That glass ain't done you harm." The rider by the rail hesitated, then sucked his teeth. "You heard the man," the outlaw said, not talkin' his eyes off Micah. "Ain't the glass we're here about." The rifle kept easing. Micah's hand slid inside his coat, slow as Sunday, his fingers finding the worn grip like they'd never left it. "Last chance," he said to the man with the gun. "You put that down, you walk out of this night alive." The outlaw's smile went colder. "He don't take orders from you no more," he said. "Ain't that right, boy?" The barrel lifted another inch. Somewhere someone whispered, "Lord help us," barely more than breath. Micah sighed once, a tired sound, and drew. It wasn't a fast snap, not the kind meant to impress. It was measured, a clean, practiced motion that came from bone memory, not pride. One shot cracked the dusk open, loud and lonely. The rifleman jerked, staggered back against the rail, then crumpled to the boards, weapon clattering from his hand. The town flinched as one, lamps shivering in their brackets. For a heartbeat everything held frozen. Then the outlaw's hand blurred for his own gun, anger finally breaking the calm in his eyes. Micah did not rush the second shot. He saw the muzzle coming up, saw where it pointed, not at him, but at the nearest porch where a shadow showed behind the posts. "No," Micah said, and pulled the trigger again. The slug took the outlaw high, spinning him half around. His gun fired wild, the shot throwing up dirt in the empty street. He staggered, stumbled 2 steps, then went to one knee, hand pressed to his side, breath coming hard. One of his men tensed like he might go for a weapon. Another grabbed his arm. "Leave it," that one muttered. "Ain't worth dying over." The outlaw looked up at Micah, teeth bared in something close to a grin and close to a snarl. "Still shoot straight," he rasped. "Should have known." Micah's gun stayed out, barrel low but ready. "I shoot when I must," he said, "not for what's past, for what's standin' right in front of me." The outlaw coughed a wet little laugh. "Town won't thank you for diggin' that iron up," he said. "Maybe they shouldn't. I ain't doin' it for thanks," Micah answered. "I'm doin' it so they see this end with me, not with them." The outlaw's gaze slid along the street, taking in the faces in the windows, the men on the porches, the way nobody cheered. Nobody stepped out clapping him on the back. Just watching, holding their breath. "You hear that, boys?" he said, voice going thin. "Man's talking it all on himself again, same as before." One of his riders shifted, uneasy. "Boss," he said, "we can still ride." The outlaw swallowed, eyes coming back to Micah. "Reckon you got what you came for?" Micah asked. "You found Jonah." A long beat passed. Then the outlaw let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than anything else. "Found a preacher wearing his ghost," he said. "Ain't quite the same." His fingers loosened. The gun in his hand slid to the dirt. Behind him, the rider's shoulders sagged. "Take him," Micah said quietly to them. "You carry him out of this town and you don't bring his quarrel back through my doors." One nodded once, wary. "You gonna stop us?" he asked. Micah holstered his gun, the motion slow and final. "Not if you're leavin'," he said. "If you're done." They lifted their wounded man, grunts soft in the cooling air, and led him toward the far end of the street, steps dragging but steady. No one followed. No one called after them. Doors stayed half open, lamps steady, eyes tracking till the shadows swallowed horse and man alike. When the dust settled back down and the echo of hooves faded into the dark, the town breathed out in small, scattered pieces. A window shutting here, a child's soft sob there, a man clearing his throat on a porch. A woman's voice came from just beyond the church gate. "Reverend," she called, unsure. "You all right?" Micah looked down at the gun hanging at his side, then up at the folks watching. "Get your young ones inside," he said. "Hold 'em close tonight, that's all." One by one they did, doors closing gentle, not slammed, until the street lay near empty again. The lamps along the fronts burned low, their flames steadying now the danger had passed, but no one came to slap his shoulder or name him hero. He turned back toward the study, each step slower than the one before. Inside, he shut the door soft, slid the belt off his waist and laid the gun bare on the table beside the Bible. For a long moment he just stood looking at it. "We're done," he said at last, voice worn. "You and me, we're done." He wrapped the iron back in its oiled cloth, carried it to the corner, and lifted the board once more. The gun went down into the dark, same as before, only now with fresh echoes clinging to it. He set the plank back, pressed it down with his heel, and let his weight rest there until the floor felt still under him. Then he crossed to the lamp. watched the flame dance a heartbeat longer and blew it out, leaving the room and the day that had finally buried Jonah Pike in quiet. You've been riding with old Western stories. If the tale hit your mark, give it a like, drop a comment about your favorite part, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next trail we ride. Don't forget, hit that subscribe so you're always in the saddle, and you'll always be ready when the next story rides in.